Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. If we haven't met, my name is Father Michael Holman and I'm the principal of Heythrop College, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. And on behalf of the staff and students of the college, and on behalf of you all, I am delighted to welcome Baroness Scotland and Asthal, who will deliver this evening the second of our Loschert Lectures, The Thinking Catholic in Public Life, Reflections on Faith, Government and Social Justice. Now, as many of you will know, and as you can see from these banners on either side of me, Heythrop College is celebrating during this academic year the 400th anniversary of its foundation by the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, as a philosophy and theology college in Louvain in Flanders in 1614. And these Loschert Lectures are one of the principal ways in which we are celebrating what is, I think, by any standards, quite an achievement. Our purpose in this lecture series is to reflect on how people of faith engage today with issues of concern to the common good. This is the Jesuit tradition, if you like, and this, expressed in many different ways, has been the tradition of this Jesuit college since its foundation all those years ago. And Lady Scotland is eminently well suited to reflect with us this evening on issues of faith and the common good. For her record of public service is long and it is distinguished. Lady Scotland took silk in 1991, the first black woman to do so, and the youngest QC or KC since William Pitt the Younger in the 18th century. Now, Lady Scotland was named a Millennium Commissioner in '94, has been a member of the Commission for Racial Equality, received a life peerage in 1997, and was Minister of State for the criminal justice system and law reform under 3 successive Home Secretaries. And then, in 2007, Baroness Scotland was appointed Attorney General, the first woman to be appointed to this office since it was established 700 years ago. Now, no less significant has been Lady Scotland's contribution to the life and the work of the Catholic Church. Now, in his apostolic exhortation published earlier this week, The Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis paints in detail a picture of the Church as a welcoming church, out in the world, actively engaged with men and women responding with the mercy and love of Jesus to their needs and their aspirations, and doing so joyfully. In service of this church out in the world, Lady Scotland has been chair of the National Catholic Safeguarding Commission for England and Wales, is currently patron of Missio, and has consistently shown a care for the marginalised, be it those who suffer from domestic violence or for those families separated across borders. Lady Scotland is also a Dame of the Constantinian Order of St. George, a Catholic order open to membership from all denominations. And so, the Thinking Catholic in Public Life, Reflections on Faith, Government and Social Justice. After the lecture, there will be time for questions for 15 minutes or so. But now, let us all give a warm welcome to Baroness Scotland of Asthal.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Father Holman. Reverend Fathers, Lords, my Lords, Ladies and Gentlemen, Honourable Members, friends, sisters and brothers, I have to tell you that standing before you this evening is far more daunting than anything I have yet done. It's only right that I should start off with a reflection made by His Holiness, that great Jesuit in a Franciscan cloak, who is, of course, as we all know, infallible, speaking about Catholics involved in politics. And the Pope said this: I believe that Catholics involved in politics carry the values of their religion within them, but have the mature awareness and expertise to implement them. The Church will never go beyond its task of expressing and disseminating its values, at least as long as I am here. Now, as a good judge, I would like to say I agree. And I could really stop there. However, something tells me that I might not be forgiven, particularly by a Jesuit college renowned for its rigour and intellectual discipline. It reminds me, I think, of two priests. There was a Jesuit and a Franciscan who sat down to a cup of tea and a slice of cake together. There was only 2 pieces of cake left, one small and the other large. The Jesuit reached over and took the larger piece for himself. The Franciscan argued, St. Francis always taught us to take the smaller piece. The Jesuit replied, I know, that's why I took the bigger bit. So in true Jesuit tradition, I will endeavour to give you a couple of slices of food for thought, but I will take the smaller slice. I'd like to thank you for asking me to reflect on what it means to be a thinking Catholic in public life. However, it's an honour which I have had only once before, but it's rested surprisingly heavily on me as I contemplated the enormity of what I'd been asked to do. And indeed, as many of you all know, I've been a barrister for more than 35 years, and speaking in public, even when it's about my faith, has never troubled me unduly. So I was asking myself, why am I troubled about speaking specifically on these matters of personal faith for a second time tonight? And I think perhaps it's because of the idea of a thinking Catholic incorporates the possibility of an unthinking Catholic. That phrase contemplates its antithesis. The automaton, programmed from birth to accept a set of theological concepts, detached from reality, not subjected to intellectual rigour, a set of beliefs simply consumed whole as truth, not questioned nor examined. A faith correlating with a concept of blind, unquestioning, uncritical acceptance, something which need not engage the head, nor the heart, nor the soul of the person, but rather setting a framework for a set of behaviours, the completion of which give voice to an outward expression of compliance, but not giving or providing the essence, or even giving the impression of an inward conversion or a tussle with those given truths. So a view of Catholicism that in many respects is rigid, inflexible, which is traditional, all-encompassing, conservative and unchanging, but not necessarily the truth, and not necessarily loving. In contrast, I think it's often the nonconformist theologians who have somehow been seen as the thinkers as opposed to the believers. They are the ones who many perceive as having challenged the norm, the accepted view, protested against the received wisdom, creating a new vision, a new interpretation of the old theology, the testing, teasing, challenging, thinking about the faith that came from a different tradition. And it's that comparison which has tended almost by inference to suggest that those of us who've adhered to the old religion, the Roman Catholic tradition, did so blindly and without thought. And often in public discourse, this idea of detachment from analysis and thought became in many people's minds, and I would say improperly, associated with Catholicism. But one of the things I found quite interesting is to examine people like Blessed Newman's past as Catholicism, because of course many of you know he came from the Protestant tradition to learn that the Catholicism was the truth. For in examining the faith into which he was born and examining it rigorously, he, I think, discovered the truth that was vested in our Catholic faith. And Blessed Newman is now seen as quintessentially the thinking Catholic's Catholic. And he is an extraordinary role model for those seeking to live an integrated life, mind and spirit. And Blessed Newman, I think, was called and chose to engage in the debates of his time. He was a thinker whose vocation was to apply his keen intellect and prolific pen to the subjects of the day. And yet alongside that, he witnessed to, in how he lived, in what he said and wrote, and a deep, transforming personal faith. But the truth as we all know it is there have always been thinkers in the Catholic faith. The non-traditionalists, the revolutionaries, many of them are to be found amongst the order of Jesuits. So it's perhaps interesting that we have our first Jesuit priest as Pope, who by the same token has taken as his name my favourite saint, St. Francis. So, and maybe a slice therefore of the Franciscan cake has been taken up there too. So the popes in recent times, I think, have all been thinkers, theologians of real note. But I think perhaps with this pope in particular, with a commitment to pastoral ministry joining heart and head, it has now become more accepted that to be a Catholic and to question and to explore and to think is more acceptable. And certainly I've noticed a growing willingness amongst Catholics, and whether many of you have too in recent months, to profess with an increasing degree of pride that they are indeed, like Pope Francis, Catholic. And I've been surprised the number of people who've come up to me and go, excuse me, I'd just like you to know, I am indeed a Catholic. And that for many of us, I think, is new, and it's welcome, and it's joyous. And in the recent past, I think public figures were very reluctant to acknowledge faith in God. The view that we don't do God was, I think, very prevalent. And it was always seen as a bit odd to be a Christian and out. Well, I've been out all my life. And if I look back at the 1970s, when I joined my profession, the bar, and consider all the other professions that I touched or was involved in, it really wasn't acceptable for any of the individuals to acknowledge their faith, and you certainly didn't bring your faith into work. That wasn't the done thing to do. You really had to leave your religion at home. So to confess to having beliefs of a strongly religious nature was tantamount to confessing to your peers that you were intellectually limited and fundamentally unsound. And it's really ironic, because if we look back in the 1950s, being an atheist was considered to be beyond the pale. Yet by the 1970s, strong religious faith was the subject of ridicule. And this is a really odd transition to have happened so quickly in such a short period of our history. So being an intellectual Christian was seen almost as a contradiction in terms. If you were seen to accept a set of beliefs that are fantastical, illogical, and unscientific. So how many times have we heard, surely you can't believe in the virgin birth? Or that Jesus died on the cross to redeem us all and rose from the dead, and that God can move mountains. Surely you're just talking in metaphors. You don't really believe it's real, do you? And when we answer yes, we do, it's been interesting, and I'm sure many of you will have had the same experience, to see the reaction to those statements. So if you laid any claim to intellectual prowess, it would be the death knell to admit to having such fundamental beliefs. And I have to tell you that I never hesitated to acknowledge when I did my cases that it was by God's will and I gave him the glory. And I remember at one stage coming back from court, having succeeded in a different case, and one of my friends said to one of my other friends in chambers, "Oh yes, Patricia's won the case, but we all know God did it, didn't he?" To which actually I was able to say, yeah, I'm glad you noticed. Right. So that is, I think, for all of us, whatever our professions, it's a challenge to admit that God is in control. And it was in this context that I, as a young woman, began to interrogate my faith from a thinking perspective. Coming from an ecumenical family, my mother was a Catholic, and my father was a Methodist. My parents were married for almost 70 years, and neither of them ever converted to the other's faith. And my parents' marriage in 1937, I think, demanded a papal dispensation, because my mother wanted a full nuptial mass in the cathedral, and my father was happy to have that, but he wasn't happy to convert. And that's interesting, being one of my parents' 12 only children. I was their 10th child and their 4th daughter, and my parents used to say they only had one of each of us. So there was no impediment in our family to choosing one branch or denomination or another. So I was baptized a Catholic, but my parents saw Christianity much like a great tree, rooted in fertile soil and nourished by spiritual waters, each branch different, but each branch providing shade and shelter of the same tree. And their approach was that regardless of denomination, we should come and sit under its shade and become the leaves of the same branch and the branches of the same tree. Our humanity is shared, just like our DNA. More than 99% of the great faith's message is the same, and provide comfort and succor for those in pain and in need of solace. And if we concentrated on what joined us rather than the 1% which separated us, we could find and coexist with each other in peace, harmony, and in love. That was their belief for the whole of their lives, and it became mine. However, I am quintessentially, as you know, a lawyer, and coming from that ecumenical background and having been brought up in a very broad-based Christian, happy to go anywhere, I nevertheless was called to interrogate to which branch did I truly belong. I was baptized a Catholic, but did I want to remain within the Catholic family? If I did, why should I? Some of my brothers and sisters chose another path. Unfortunately for my father, none of us became Methodists, but the Church of England did rather well. So, being a thinker, I had to decide whether I was content to remain a Catholic, whether I wanted to make Catholicism a positive choice. And being a Christian was an integral part of who I was and who I am, and I couldn't actually separate the two. So throughout my life, my Christianity has informed how I see things, how I respond, how I shape my arguments, and how I see the world more broadly. So why did I choose to remain a Catholic? What was it about Catholicism that spoke to me in particular after intellectual contemplation? Well, I went back to the Bible, and I don't know whether that's part of my Methodist tradition. I think it's part of my Catholic tradition, but you'll probably know, those of you who've never been anywhere else, which one it is. And I went to the Sermon on the Mount and I dissected it. What did Jesus say, and where was this best reflected? The theology in that sermon is really not easy. It's very challenging. And I think it was just as challenging 2,000 years ago as it is today. And if we're honest, Catholicism is one of the most challenging and I think most difficult forms of theology with which to adhere. It's fundamentally counter-cultural. But after considering all the different aspects of Christianity, I felt it would have, and I have to say this, I felt it would have been so much easier if intellectually I could have conned myself into becoming an Anglican or a Methodist or a Baptist. But I couldn't. I strongly believe that in my Father's house there are many rooms, and Catholicism for me was the brightest room, generating the most light and the greatest truth. And it was for me the straight route, the true route. It reminded me of what's said in Malachi chapter 3, verse 3, which talks about God as a silversmith refining. And I then looked up how a silversmith refines silver. And what he does, he puts the silver in a bowl, puts that bowl in the hottest part of the fire. He watches over the silver, never leaving it, never taking his eye off it, even for a second, and he watches all the impurities being burnt away. And the silversmith knows when the silver is perfect, when he can see his reflection in the silver. And then he pulls it out of the fire. And I've always felt very strongly that's what God does to us. That's what our Catholicism does. It puts us in some of the hottest places, but it burns away that which is not worthy. And what is left is a reflection of Christ himself. So I believe that Catholicism was the tenets of Catholicism delivered that process in the most effective way. Difficult, arduous, sometimes painful, but in a way which Christ can finally be reflected in our lives. And it has always struck me that this is often very much what life is like. God wants us to be his eyes, his mouth, to do his work. But we need to be willing instruments. Saying, thy will be done, is really a very hard thing, especially when he is asking you to do things you don't really want to do. And this, I think, is really the challenge of being a thinking Catholic. It's both simultaneously a heavy load and liberating. Liberating in so much as God walks with you, and that through his grace all things are possible. A heavy load because what he asks us to do is often difficult to achieve, and it's only possible by his grace. So the praise is his, and the responsibility to follow is ours. And this, I think, doesn't allow you to stay in your comfort zone. And it can be really challenging because the successes are not actually your successes, but they're God's. And there was real clarity as to who deserved the praise and who the praise should go to. So trying to listen and trying to do what is asked, I think, is one of the biggest challenges if we're trying to be thinking Catholics. So what I found was of fundamental importance was two particular things. Firstly, the challenge that as God walks with all of us, as Christians, we need to follow that example. We need to walk in the shoes of other people, particularly the poor, the disadvantaged, those who are far from God, those who need love, and those who have no voice of their own. The opportunity to do this presents itself every day, and the thinking Catholic has to ask his or herself every day, what have you done for someone else and for God? It's a nagging feeling that can't ever be ignored, at least not for too long. And I know that when I was a child, I came home and every day my mother would ask me, what have you done today? And she never meant what had I done for myself. She always meant what had I done for someone else. And it was really hard getting praise from my mother. You would think if you got 99% in something, she'd go, yes! But she wouldn't. She'd say, that's very nice. Now, darling, what have you done today? And so echoing in my head is always, what have you done today? And the secondly is identifying and using the talents that God has given you to the best of your ability. Because every single person has a talent that was given just to them and to no one else. And the key thing is to find what that talent is, to hone it and to use it for the benefit of other people. And most of us are a bit like Groucho Marx. We don't want to be a member of any club who'll have us. And the truth is, we have to recognize that if he made us as we are, he made us perfect in his sight. And he doesn't want any of us to be anything other than ourselves. And in being ourselves, to use those talents for the benefit of his people. So that opportunity is of extraordinary importance. It's very difficult to diminish what he wants us to do. Through our talents, he's given us so many opportunities that are potentially life-changing, not just for us, but for others. And this is quite difficult, being willing to be his eyes, his ears, his hands, his feet, and his heart to enable you to walk with others, because that's all he's got to use to show his love in the world. All he has is the poor things which we are. And I think it's quite a difficult task for most of us, particularly because our faith demands that we do that every minute of every day, of every week, of every month, and every year. It also demands that we see Christ in every person on earth, irrespective of their ethnicity, their gender, their religion, their intelligence, their sexual orientation, or even, perhaps I should say, especially, their meanness of spirit or their viciousness of nature. And that really is a big ask. Ultimately, I suppose it comes back to our humanity and the fact that the faith we hold demands that each person be treated equally, and that parity of treatment demands that we provide a just and equitable resolution of difficulties and create real opportunities for all to rejoice in our common humanity. And God takes us places where we really don't want to go, to do things or to be with some of the people that we really don't even like, and he makes us go there. And I found that it's a very dangerous thing to say to God, I really don't want to do X, because it's usually exactly what he decides that you have to do. I remember once someone saying to me, I really think you should go into political life. And I said, do you think I have idiot written on my forehead? Well, it's just not the forehead, is it? It's Brighton Rock all the way through. So it's being willing to go where you don't want to go, but where he perhaps needs you to go, and to go with people that you may not want to go with. And we also, I think, need to remember what he did to his own son, who he loved. And his son is our example. And understanding that puts, I think, a proper perspective on some of the things he asks of each of us. And many of us find that the things he asks aren't easy. They're challenging and difficult, but they are doable through his grace. I also think that although it's a challenge, seeing God in all people is also a real gift. Because if you look at them and you see Christ, you actually are able to see the beauty that's in every person. And I think that's a real blessing. So the real challenge is being able to translate this message and what the church says about social justice into action. And the challenge for thinking Catholics is to be the instrument or an instrument through which the lives of others can be improved. And I think for me, the most important attribute that one can have is a willingness and an ability to say yes to him and to let him work in our lives. So in this sense, it can be really liberating. And I certainly know when I've looked at things that I have achieved, I know that I would not have achieved any of them without his grace. So I'll give you one example, and that's the work that we did in relation to domestic violence. Domestic violence affects 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men in our country. It affects between 750,000 and 950,000 children. It is the greatest cause of morbidity in women and girls worldwide. According to the World Health Organization, it affects 1 in 3 women in the world. And in our country, 120 women in 2003 were dying every year. That's 2 or 3 women a week, and it was costing us economically £23 billion a year. And when in 2003 I was given the task of chairing the interministerial group and given 2 small tasks by the then Prime Minister. One was to reduce crime, very easy. 2 was to address the issue of domestic violence more effectively. And when I said that I believe that we together, that's government, local government, NGOs, business, individuals, people of faith and people of none, if we work together, we could change things. I remember it so clearly. People said, "Oh, Patricia, isn't she sweet? She thinks they're going to work together." But I believed through God's grace and through prayer and through hard work, we could do this if we chose. And we did. From 2003 to 2010, together, everybody working, people of faith, people of none, people, all of us working together, we managed to reduce domestic violence by 64%, and we reduced the cost to our country by £7 billion a year. So if I can give you an idea of what that meant for London, in 2003, 49 women died. Every murder cost us about 1.1 million to prosecute. By the time I left government in 2005, how many women do you think died in London that year? Give me, anyone got an idea? No? 5. Now, I believe that was by his grace, because I was called mad. Well, I am mad, but I have a father who isn't. And so through prayer and through belief, I think belief can quite often enable you to have the courage to continue to do things and work on things when other people will have given up. And persuading others to work with you is a real opportunity. So work through prayer and prayer through work. The doing can become a prayer. And through this, I think there's a real challenge for contemplative action. So I think caring about issues are central about bringing about change, trying to put yourselves in others' shoes, seeing through their eyes, feeling what they felt, understanding why they are behaving in the way they are was central to part of the analysis of the problem and finding a solution. And this was really important for us to look at the things that joined those different groups in order to help them to work together to bring about real change. So through that understanding, we were able to build a bridge to create the change that we all wanted to deliver. And it also gave all of those working on these issues strength to continue to work, even when everybody else thought you were crazy. Because crazy people can end up doing some really wonderful things. So the essence, I think, was being ready to serve, to use the gifts, however limited they may appear to be, that he has given us to help his people. And his people are not just the people who we know, who are kind to us and friendly to us. They also include those who weren't and aren't, those you have never met but may be affected by the choices you make, what you did or failed to do. Each of us can be a channel of his peace. And as I said earlier, we are his hands to do his work, his feet to walk beside others, his mouth to speak the word which would bring balm and succour to those in despair, his ears to listen, to learn, his heart to love and share and show compassion. We, all of us, are and will always be his body if we choose. But the real issue for us is, do we choose? In my time in government, I have found my faith invaluable, because the change, and I've just talked about one tonight, but there are many other opportunities and situations where without my faith, I don't know how I would have brought about any change, much less the changes that were possible. And so in looking at these issues, I think it's imperative, if we are to deliver social justice as thinking Catholics, for us to respond to the challenge which is given us in the Gospels. And it's something that echoes with me all the time. The part in Matthew where Christ says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me." And when people ask, well, when did I do that, Lord? The answer always echoes within me, for as much as you have done this to the least of these, you have done it to me. And I've always wanted to be able to say, if I was asked the question, what did you do? Where were you? I really always wanted to be able to answer, I was there, Lord. I may not have done as well as I should or could have done, but I really tried. I was there, Lord. And it's in this understanding of faith that has given me a desire to walk in other people's shoes, to see the pain and understand the fear that they feel. Because I think until you walk in others' shoes, you really don't understand their position. And this is the essence of crafting policy and when representing a client and making a difference. So let me end with a reflection by Father Pedro Arrupe, who is a great Jesuit. He says, what you are in love with, what seizes your imagination, will affect everything. It will decide what gets you out of bed in the mornings, what you do with your evenings, how you spend your weekends, what you read, who you know, what breaks your heart, and what amazes you. Fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything. It is this love of humanity and a love of Christ that has fundamentally shaped my work as a thinking Catholic, and I hope it shapes yours too.
Thank you, Lady Scotland, for that wonderful, wonderful view of how it is that someone in public life can live by faith. I found it truly inspirational and very encouraging, if I may say, in my own life. Thank you very much indeed. I should also say to you, Lady Scotland, that there is a Franciscan in this audience with whom I had cake this afternoon. Only I'm sure he took the bigger piece. Now, Lady Scotland has agreed to take some questions for about 10-15 minutes. So if you would like to ask a question, you would be truly most welcome. What I'm going to say is just for about 30 seconds, just talk to your neighbour for a moment and let's surface some questions. I always think that's a good idea. So let's do that for a moment.
Well, firstly, I'm really delighted that I'm a member of the House of Lords, so it's impossible for me to be the Prime Minister, but I don't think that being a Catholic would get in the way. We haven't had a Catholic as Prime Minister, or a Catholic and out as a Prime Minister yet, but I think it can come. I was only the second Attorney General to be a Catholic since the Reformation. Rawlinson was the last and only Catholic, and actually lots of people thought it was quite a dangerous thing to be a Catholic Attorney General. Things seem to happen to them in the past. But the rules were changed to allow Catholics to be Lord Chancellor, and they weren't allowed to do that before. So I don't think there's any impediment to being Prime Minister and being a Catholic.
The next question was over here, this young woman in the front.
Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you. Penelope Vauxhall, I have a historical connection with the university. Good evening, Baroness. A good number of us here present will be familiar with the end of the Year of Faith celebrated in the Catholic Church, and I would like to know how that helped you in the last year.
Well, I think it was certainly something that we prayed at the end of every Mass, and I think it was a good reflection and a good reminder. Certainly for me, I try to pray every day. So I suppose it was a reinforcement of what we were always doing. I don't know about any of you, but I quite often pray on the run about everything. And so it was perhaps a reminder that you needed to spend not only praying on the run time, but special time where you can have quiet opportunities. But I actually think that 2013 has been a very, very difficult year. So I have been very blessed this year by still being alive. So I'm very grateful. Do you want to?
Gerald.
You have just given us one of the most powerful homilies that I have ever heard. And in the light of that, I and my colleague here would like to ask your opinion about the case for women becoming priests in the Catholic Church.
Well, I actually like the idea of women becoming cardinals even more. And I think it's a really exciting vision that's being talked about by Pope Francis now, because as many of you all know, to be a cardinal, you don't have to be a priest. You have to be a deacon, but you don't have to be a priest. But there's even an opportunity for His Holiness, if he chose, therefore to circumvent that. And wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if women could be part of the leadership and thinking, beating heart of our church? And if we look back at the tradition actually women were always part of the disciples of Christ. They weren't the apostles, but if you look at who was faithful and who never left him, it was the women. It was the women who stayed by his side at the foot of the cross. And I always think it's very important that it was to the women that Christ gave the message of his resurrection. He trusted it to women to get it right. Yep.
Hello. You've talked about being a Catholic in the House of Lords. I was wondering, given that you work alongside a number of Anglican bishops and other Christians of different denominations in the House of Lords, what's your experience, and how would you, if you had to distinguish or to say what is it that's distinctive about a Catholic approach as opposed to an Anglican or other Christian approach in that setting?
Well, firstly, I think people of faith in our house, and I'm sure my right honourable, my noble friends who are here will agree with me, tend to work together. Sharing any faith at all is really important, because you have people of faith and people of none, and garnering support for those of us who believe in God in whatever manifestation he comes to you through your faith is very important. And what I tried to say in my talk is that if you look at all the faiths, 99% of what is said is identical. It's the 1% which causes the difference. And if you look at our DNA, it's the same. It's the 1% of our DNA which says whether we're male, whether we're female, whether we're black, whether we're white, whether we're short, whether we're fat, whether we're small. And I think what happens is so many times people concentrate on that 1%, I think, or 0.1%, as opposed to the 99% that joins us. And I think my experience has been those of faith in the house tend to concentrate on the 99% that joins us as opposed to the 1% that separates us. But for my own journey, looking at the difference between the Catholic way and the Anglican way, for example, one of the real issues for me was the Sermon on the Mount. Christ says some quite hard things in that sermon about marriage, because the Jews had a paper of divorcement, and they said, you know, you've been told if you and your wife don't agree, you can put her to a side. And he said, I tell you that you can't, that if you marry another, you commit adultery. Now that's tough, but it's what he said. So that's why I say that what we believe isn't always comfortable or easy, but for me it was true. And I wish I wasn't this pedant of a lawyer, because I was trying to construct an argument which would allow me to say the Anglicans were okay on that. But we know that their tradition came from Henry VIII needing another wife. And I remember my son, when he was quite really young, I was so shocked, said to me, "Mummy, didn't adultery do an awful lot of harm?" Boy was right.
Gentleman over here. Microphone.
Tony Blair once said that God told him to go to war in Iraq, and I just wondered what your thoughts on that statement were.
I think, I don't know whether he said that or not, but what I do know is that if you are a committed person of faith, you make no major decision without praying a lot about it. Now, whether after your prayer and contemplation you come to the right decision is another matter, because none of us are infallible. And I don't say that you avoid your own responsibility for the issues and the decisions you make. I think what most people would say is work as hard as you can, find out as much as you can, pray as hard as you can, and then make a decision. But whatever decision you make, you then have to live with. And for us, of course, there's always a path to forgiveness.
we take two more questions? Here's one.
I know you've mentioned Sermon on the Mount. How important is the Torah and the Injil, either the Old and New Testament, in your life? But this is a Muslim speaking.
Yeah. No, I think it's very important, and what I did another time I looked at the tenets of the Abrahamic faith. And if you look at the essence of the Torah, we would say as Christians that Christ fulfilled. If you look at Isaiah, Christ fulfilled all the tenets of the Torah. And the three faiths of the book, as they're quite often called, we're all waiting for the same coming. For the Jews, it's the first coming. For us, it's the second coming. And for Muslims, as you know, it's the coming of the Son, but Muhammad was the last prophet. And Jesus was considered to be a great prophet, but not the Son of God. So that's why I say if you look at all the great faiths, the essence of those faiths are the same. The differences are small. And what I had to do when I was trying to decide what my faith would be to interrogate those other faiths and then decide which one was true for me. And I do believe in the bit in the Bible where it says, in my Father's house there are many rooms. And that's why I said for me, Catholicism was the brightest, most light-filled room, and the room which showed the greatest degree of love. But I also know that many people in my own family took a different path and are a part of a different tradition, and I love them just as much. And they forgive me for my faith as I forgive them for theirs.
The most interesting aspect of your talk for me, and perhaps for others, was the way in which you had come out as a Catholic, and the way that your faith infused and shaped what you did. To what extent was this faith within you, and to what extent was it made public, articulately, noticeably so? And to what extent, as someone said, your talk was remarkably impressive, and in what way are you different, more effective as a Catholic public figure than other Catholic public figures?
Well, I think, it's very nice of you to say that, I don't know whether it's true. I think the reality for me was that I was always unusual. I was never going to fit into anyone's idea of what I should be. So if you can think about me growing up, I am one of 12 children. I am Roman Catholic, socialist, educated not privately, didn't go to Oxford, so I didn't fit anyone's view of what I should be. I came to the bar at a stage where women were only 7% of the bar. So one of the advantages for me is I couldn't be but myself. I'm never going to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant and male. I'm not going to be able to fit into their... So I had to be true to me. And being a Christian, and I used to say I was a Christian first and a Catholic second, being a Christian was a fundamental part of who I was. And therefore, if I was to survive, I had to be me, which meant that I did pray about my cases. And people just thought I was odd, but I'd always been odd. So that by the time I became Silk, and people, and there was a lot of news coverage, and they said, why do you think you have achieved what you have achieved? And I said very openly, by the grace of God, that I do not believe this was me. Everything good that I have done has been by His grace, and any mistakes I've made have been mine. And that was possible for me because I've always been out. I've been out as soon as I went to the bar. I've never hesitated to talk about my faith. But I also realise that that also can make you a target. And lots of people are very frightened about being open about their faith. And when I talk to people about faith, they then respond about their faith. But it's like getting permission. And when you go to the House of Lords, I don't know whether some of my colleagues have had the same experience, and we go down to the St Mary Undercroft is where we have Mass. The most extraordinary thing is people going, oh, I didn't know you were Catholic. It's like, we're out. So I think that was always a positive for me, and maybe it was an advantage. And I was also brought up to believe that you must not be afraid. Don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to try. Be terrified of not trying. And so if you're not afraid to fail, if you believe that God walks with you and that no matter where you go, he will be there. I mean, I grew up with my mother saying, you know, no one can hurt you unless they go through God first. The things that are for you cannot be taken away from you. It is according to his grace. And so I grew up with a very devoutly Catholic woman and a forensically committed Methodist. And I tell you, that combination is really something to behold. And so that's why I think I've had the opportunity to be open about my faith. And I don't in any way deprecate people who are not, because actually it's quite scary talking about yourself so openly. And it makes you feel quite vulnerable. And lots of people find that quite difficult. And that's why I say to you, God asks you to do things you'd really rather not do. But, you know, by his grace, I believe all things are possible. So tonight has been possible by his grace. Whether I'll thank him in the morning, I don't know.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Lady Scotland. We've all had a wonderful evening so far. I've had a wonderful evening. I think we all have. It's been a real pleasure to listen to this person of faith talk about her faith in public life. It's been tremendous. And I now invite you all to continue our time together by coming through the hall and up the stairs and to the right, to those rooms you were in earlier, in fact, to share some food. There is lots, so please, please, please do come. And also, I hope, a glass of wine. But before you go, on your chair, you have details of some of the forthcoming events here at Heythrop College. Now, next Monday, Professor John O'Malley from Georgetown University, who's an eminent church historian who's receiving an honorary doctorate from us earlier that afternoon, will be speaking on Vatican II Revisited, the Pope Francis Effactor. Okay, so that should be worth coming to. So please do, 7 o'clock next Monday evening. You can see the website where you can book your place. And there are other events next week, which we've next term, which we've highlighted there, and full details will be on our website in the next couple of weeks. You'll also see a fundraising booklet. What we're trying to do in this 400th anniversary is raise £400,000 for scholarships, so that young people in these days of £9,000 tuition fees won't be put off by the prospect of those fees and can come to study philosophy and theology, and especially those young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. We do need your help in that. We are not a wealthy college. Believe me, we are not a wealthy college. So please do help us if you can on that. And there are details in that booklet about how to help us. And finally, up in the reception, or just outside, you will see these calendars, and we invite you to make a donation towards the cost of these calendars. Take one away with you, and the donations will all go towards the support of the work of the Society of Jesus in Britain. Mr. William Loschert is the generous donor who makes these lectures possible. Alas, he is not able to be with us. He is an American citizen, and where is he on Thanksgiving evening? But in the United States, celebrating Thanksgiving. And if there are any other Americans here, we wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving Day. Finally, I want to echo Jim's thanks. Lady Scotland, at the end of your talk, you made reference to Father Pedro Arrupe, the wonderful Father Arrupe, General of the Jesuits after the Vatican II. Clearly such an influence on the present Pope, not least on Pope Francis. And he wanted all his educational institutions to educate, first of all, men and women for others. In your talk, you have spoken about your work for the marginalized, the poor, and the disadvantaged. And you have given us an example of what it is to be, in public life, a woman for others. And above all, Baroness, I want to thank you very much for the example that you were given as a person of faith, living the life of Jesus and being therefore available for the marginalized, the poor, and the disadvantaged. That, above all, matters. And thank you very much, and come again, and always consider yourself, I hope, a great friend of Heythrop College. Thank you very much indeed.